In the town of Reading in Berkshire, England, there stands an impressive 30-foot-high statue of a lion, and underneath it are the names of 329 men of the local regiment who were killed during the Second Anglo Afghan War. 258 of them died in one battle on a dusty plain in Afghanistan in 1880. They were part of a British army that was destroyed by the Afghans at the Battle of Maiwand. Fought on the 27th of July 1880, the Battle of Maiwand was one of the greatest defeats ever suffered by one of Queen Victoria's armies. Over 900 men were wiped out. Largely overshadowed by the last stand at Gandamak in the First Anglo-Afghan War over 30 years beforehand, and by the Zulu victory at Isandlwana the previous year, Maiwand tends to be a forgotten battle. Even local people in Reading probably wonder what that lion statue is really all about. Like a lot of old memorials, people walk past them without ever bothering to find out the story. So, here is the story of the British defeat at the Battle of Maiwand in Afghanistan, 1880. But before we get to the battle, what on earth were the British doing in Afghanistan anyway? Well, it's a complicated story of imperial rivalries between Russia and Britain. But here is a very top-line 2-minute explanation. Afghanistan was stuck between the expanding Russian Empire and the British Empire in India. Both imperial powers wanted to exert influence in Afghanistan at the expense of their rival. Thus, when the Emir of Afghanistan signed a treaty of friendship with the Russians, the British became alarmed and demanded a similar treaty. When the Afghans refused, the British decided to force the issue and invaded in 1878. It wasn't the first time the British had invaded Afghanistan. On the previous occasion, in the 1840s, they had met with initial success, only to be forced to retreat from the capital Kabul. That retreating column was massacred on their way out of the country, with the 44th Regiment making a famous last stand at Gandamak. Now this Second Anglo-Afghan War followed the previous pattern. Marching to Kabul, the British forced the Emir, Yaqub Khan, to sign a treaty. The Afghans, as we know all too well from recent history, are a fiercely independent people, and ever since the 1840s they'd had a hatred for the British. So despite the treaty and the British occupying Kabul and some other cities, the Afghan tribesmen in the mountains refused to lie down. Soon, in a repeat of the First Anglo-Afghan War, the British found themselves under siege in Kabul. Sir Donald Stewart now marched his army from Kandahar to relieve the British garrison in Kabul, which was commanded by a young officer, Frederick Roberts. Behind him, he left Kandahar, garrisoned by a force under Major-General Primrose. The city itself was governed by a local Afghan wali who seemed to be on their side. Stuart's arrival in Kabul raised the siege, and the tribesmen once more drifted off into the safety of the mountains. Meanwhile, in the west of the country, the Emir's brother, Ayub Khan, had gathered an army and was now marching towards Kandahar. In the city, the wali urged General Primrose to take decisive action. Which brings us to the Battle of Maiwand. On the 4th of July, 1880, General Primrose sent out a field force to deal with this threat. Commanded by Brigadier-General George Burrows, it consisted of some 1,500 infantry and 350 cavalry. It was a mixed force, drawn from the Indian Army and the regular British Army, the latter comprising of the 66th Regiment of Foot. The 66th would later become the Royal Berkshire Regiment, and after further amalgamations, are now part of the Rifles. The Indian contingent was drawn from the Bombay Army. The infantry comprised the 1st Bombay Grenadiers and the 30th Bombay Native Infantry, Jacob's Rifles. The Grenadiers had been formed way back in 1778 and were one of the oldest regiments in the Indian Army. It was the Bombay Army that also contributed the cavalry force under Brigadier-General Nuttall. They were the 3rd Queen's Own Cavalry and the 3rd Sind Horse. As a matter of interest, Sir Evelyn Wood, who I've recently talked about, was awarded his VC whilst on attachment with the 3rd Queen's Own Cavalry back in the 1850s. Also accompanying the force were B and E batteries of the Royal Horse Artillery, and half a company of Bombay engineers and sappers, the latter commanded by 31-year-old Lieutenant Thomas Henn, on attachment from the Royal Engineers. Burrows's field force would rendezvous with the Wali of Kandahar's supporters who were already in the field. Despite the Wali of Kandahar being keen to oppose Ayub Khan, his army were less than enthusiastic. Memories last a long time in Afghanistan, and since the 1840s there was little love for the British. So why would the Wali's men fight for the British invaders, most of whom were not Muslims, against their fellow Muslim countrymen. When Burrows' force arrived, the Afghans promptly deserted and headed off into the mountains. As they left, the 66th were able to capture 6 smoothbore guns, which they added to their own arsenal. On the night of the 26th of July, scouts reported that the Afghan army was heading through the Maiwand Pass towards the village of Maiwand, about 3.5 miles, 6 kilometres, from his camp. Burrows insisted that his baggage train accompany them as they advanced, so it wasn't until the early hours of the morning of the 27th of July that the British finally moved off to intercept the Afghans. By the time the sun was rising, Burrows could see the dust rising from the Afghan army across the semi-arid plain, and it was a heck of a lot of dust. Dust made by 12,000 warriors. Ayub Khan's army consisted of 3,000 cavalry and 9,000 infantry. The British were horribly outnumbered by something like 10 to 1. And whilst a large contingent of that army was made up of tribesmen, Khan also possessed trained regular soldiers, formerly of his father and brother's garrison at Kabul. And there amidst his men were the former warriors of the Wali of Kandahar. Furthermore, Khan's army also consisted of 6 batteries of artillery, 36 guns in total. Against that, Brigadier-General Burrows had 6 guns from the Royal Horse Artillery, and the 6 guns captured when the Wali's men switched sides. Despite the size of the Afghan army and all those guns, Burrows ordered his force to advance and engage the enemy. Moving across the plain, they suddenly found their route to the Afghans blocked by a ravine, 25 feet deep in places. Do you ever think that sometimes you're being given a sign not to proceed? Well, if Burrows had that thought, he decided to ignore it, and he ordered his men forward, with the Royal Horse Artillery leading the way. Once across the ravine, the guns cantered forward, leaving the infantry struggling to keep up with them. Eventually, Burrows brought his force to a halt and deployed to meet the Afghans. With his cavalry holding the left flank, the infantry were formed up on the right. The Bombay Grenadiers were at the furthest point, then Jacob's Rifles, many of whom were recent recruits, and finally the 66th. The Battle of Maiwand on the 27th of July 1880 began with an artillery duel between the 12 British guns and the 36 Afghan pieces. Throughout that long morning, with the sun beating down on the plain, the British tried to take cover from the Afghan guns. Their misery was compounded by the fact that most of them had eaten very little before the advance, and the fact that the Afghan fire and cavalry were preventing water supplies moving up from the baggage train. With their guns pinning down the British, the Afghans now started to mass for a frontal attack. Burrows, aware of this danger, ordered the Bombay Grenadiers to advance and break up the Afghan forces. Advancing over the dry, stony ground, they were making good progress against their enemy when Burrows, fearing that they might take excessive casualties, ordered them to retire. It was a pivotal moment in the Battle of Maiwand. Could they have beaten the Afghans and forced a general retreat? Well, it had happened elsewhere in this war. But maybe Burrows was correct, and the Afghans, with the numbers on their side, could have just whittled down the Grenadiers until they were too weak to resist an all-out assault. Whatever might have happened, what now happened was that over a third of his command was stuck out in no man's land trying to get back to the safety, whilst Afghan foot soldiers gave chase and their cavalry dashed through the open space between the British lines. Burrows rapidly detached 2 companies from Jacob's Rifles and, supported by some of those captured smoothbore guns, ordered them into the gap, spreading his line even thinner. When the Grenadiers finally got back to the British formation, Burrows' force came under more artillery fire, joined by musket shots that were getting closer and closer. What Burrows had not been aware of when he chose his position that morning was that another deep ravine ran parallel to his right flank. The Afghans were now using this ravine to move closer to the British lines. In fact, Ayub Khan was even able to move 2 of his guns along the ravine and then open up on the Grenadiers from just 300 metres, 300 yards. Early in the afternoon, the 2 smoothbores that had moved up to the head of the British position with the 2 companies from Jacob's Rifles ran out of ammunition. Their crews limbered up the guns and set off to find more ammunition. The 2 companies of Jacob's Rifles, made up of raw recruits, suddenly felt very exposed as the Afghans once more began to mass for an attack. Events suddenly began to move very fast, as they always do when a disaster strikes on the battlefield. The Afghans rushed towards those 2 companies, who took one look at their ferocious enemy and ran. This left the Grenadiers' left flank exposed as the Afghans surged into the gap. The attackers fell on the exhausted, dehydrated and demoralised Bombay Regiment. With the Grenadier position crumbling around them, the Royal Horse Artillery desperately tried to limber up their guns to take them to safety. As they galloped back, they spotted Burrows desperately ordering Brigadier Nuttall to charge the Afghans with his cavalry. For whatever reason, Nuttall was only able to muster 150 men, less than half of his command. They galloped forward in a half-hearted charge, and after a brief encounter with the advancing Afghans, wheeled around. What was left of the Grenadiers had fallen back into the remaining companies from Jacob's Rifles, and both Indian units were now retreating past and into the 66th. The Royal Horse Artillery now swung their guns round to fire over the head of the 66th into the Afghans rising out of the ravine, but already their position was compromised. Afghan cavalry were charging towards them. The cardinal sin of an artillery regiment in those days was to lose their guns. It was like a French Napoleonic regiment having their eagle captured, or the enemy taking a British infantry regiment's colours. There was no greater dishonour. Heroic deaths are a hallmark of British artillery batteries throughout the Victorian period, but above all, they had to save their guns, and now was one of those moments. Despite the 66th and what remained of the Indian infantry needing their support, they limbered up their guns once more and retreated across the ravine. Only hours before, they had led the British field force across it, going in the other direction. Who would have thought it would have come to this? The surrounded infantry also made for the ravine. Many of the Grenadiers died struggling to cross it. While some of the 66th had broken away and followed the escape route being taken by the Royal Horse Artillery and the cavalry, the bulk tried to stay together, falling back across the ravine to the tiny village of Keeg. There, about 100 of them made a desperate stand in a walled garden until they were overwhelmed by the Afghans. And even then, 11 of the regiment, 2 officers and 9 soldiers, somehow managed to escape the carnage and fought their way to a position outside the village. There they made their last stand. With their ammunition spent, they charged their attackers with their bayonets. The 66th lost both their regimental and the Queen's colours at Maiwand. It was the last time a British regiment lost their colours in battle. What remained of Burrows' command, including Burrows himself, fled along the track towards Kandahar. Like a lot of retreats, for those trying to escape the carnage, it must have been almost as terrifying as the battle itself, maybe more so. Afghan cavalry swept in to attack the fleeing British army. Every now and then, groups of soldiers would turn and make a stand. Sometimes they'd drive off the mounted Afghans, other times they'd be overwhelmed. 2 Victoria Crosses were awarded for acts of bravery, both for trying to rescue wounded men in this debacle, both to members of the Royal Horse Artillery. Sergeant Patrick Mullen ran through the attacking Afghans to grab a mortally wounded comrade and carried him to safety. The other Victoria Cross story is a lot more interesting. During that terrifying flight from the battlefield, Gunner James Collis deliberately drew the fire from the pursuing Afghans away from his wounded comrades on a limber towards himself. For this dangerous and selfless act of bravery, the 24-year-old Collis was awarded Britain's highest medal for valour. Cambridge-born James Collis is one of only 8 men to have forfeited his Victoria Cross. In 1895, having left the army, he was convicted of bigamy, and part of his punishment was to be stripped of his VC. Amazingly, when the First World War broke out in 1914, Collis, now aged 48, joined the Suffolk Regiment. He served in the war for the next 3 years, until being discharged on medical grounds in 1917. A year later, James Collis died of a heart attack. His VC was never restored to him, although King George V was aware of his story and subsequently commanded that no man who earned the Victoria Cross should ever have to forfeit in the future. The Battle of Maiwand was a disastrous defeat for the British, or a great victory for the Afghans. History's all about perspectives. The British lost 943 men killed and 175 wounded. The 66th had lost 62% of their strength as casualties. Back in their hometown in Reading in Berkshire, a public subscription raised funds for that impressive lion monument to be erected in honour of the 274 men and 12 officers killed in the battle, and the others killed elsewhere in this war. The Maiwand lion stands in Forbury Garden in the town, even though most locals probably don't even know the story behind it. Rudyard Kipling wrote his poem that day to honour those who fought there, and the wonderful William McGonagall, often called the worst poet in Britain, also penned a salute, The Last Berkshire 11. An interesting survivor, although fictional, was Arthur Conan Doyle's character Dr. Watson. In one story, Conan Doyle claimed that the assistant to Sherlock Holmes had been an army surgeon at the battle. The casualties weren't limited to the 66th or to the Europeans serving in the Royal Horse Artillery. The regiments from the British Indian Army lost over 600 men dead. The Bombay Grenadiers' casualty rate was 64%, including 366 dead. The 30th Bombay Native Infantry, Jacob's Rifles, had lost 241 dead and 32 wounded. 16 men from the Bombay Sappers and Engineers had died, alongside their commanding officer, Lieutenant Thomas Henn, when they had tried to hold the line as the men from Jacob's Rifles collapsed around them. What is interesting about this battle is the numbers killed versus wounded. In most battles, the wounded outnumber the killed. Not at Maiwand, where over 3/4 of the casualties were killed. The Afghans weren't interested in taking any prisoners. Despite impressive lion statues and poems from Kipling and McGonagall, nothing could disguise the sheer size of the defeat. With 973 men dead from a fighting force of 1,500, Maiwand ranks as one of the worst defeats the British suffered during the late 19th century. For the Afghans, it was a famous victory. However, it had been a costly victory. Counts vary as to their losses, mainly because no rolls were kept, but estimates suggest 2,000 killed, possibly even higher. The victorious Ayub Khan now laid siege to the British garrison in Kandahar for nearly a month. It took the arrival of Lieutenant-General Frederick Roberts at the head of an army from Kabul to raise the siege. His march and his victory at the Battle of Kandahar would propel Roberts up the greasy pole of command in the British Army. He would ultimately command the British forces in South Africa during the Boer War, and ultimately take over from his great rival, Sir Garnet Wolseley, as Commander-in-Chief of the British Army. There's one last story from the Battle of Maiwand that I'd like to share with you. Bobbie was a mongrel dog who had been adopted by Lance Sergeant Peter Kelly back when the 66th was stationed at Brock Barracks in Reading. The little dog swiftly became an unofficial mascot, and Bobbie accompanied the 66th when they were sent to India. Sergeant Kelly was one of the lucky ones at Maiwand. Despite being injured, he managed to reach safety. So too did Bobbie, but not before being in the thick of the fighting, barking and snarling at the attacking Afghans. Witnesses recall Bobbie being present in the walled garden, and some claim the loyal mongrel was even with the last 11. Well, be that as it may, the following day a scouting party coming down the road from Kandahar came across the injured little dog, hobbling in the wake of the survivors. Reunited with the wounded Sergeant Kelly, later that year Bobbie was presented to Queen Victoria, who insisted on awarding the dog with the Afghanistan Campaign Medal. I would like to say it was a happy ending to an unhappy story, but unfortunately Bobbie was killed a year later when he was run over by a hansom cab. Bobbie was so adored by the men of the 66th, who by now had been amalgamated with the 49th Regiment to form the Royal Berkshires, that he was stuffed and put on display in the Regimental Museum. The last I heard, Bobbie, well, stuffed Bobbie, can still be seen at the Rifles Museum in Salisbury. Stuffed Bobbie is not quite the Roaring Lion monument in Reading, but in his own little way, he is a reminder of a battle where over 900 soldiers from the British and British Indian armies died, long ago, on a dusty plain in Afghanistan. Well, thanks for joining me today, and I hope you enjoyed that story about the Battle of Maiwand. Check out all my other stories from British and British military history on my channel. You can also get more exclusive stories, like my recent one about the man awarded the Victoria Cross and the Iron Cross, by joining my membership channel. Click on the join button below, and there's also a link in the description. And thanks to Bill, Reese and Ragnar for joining already. Coming soon, the Battle of Atbara in Sudan, Nelson at Copenhagen, and the Angels of Mons. But in the meantime, thanks for your support, keep well, and I'll see you very soon.